In 1982, the trial for kidnapping of Stephen Stayner ended with Kenneth Parnell being found guilty and the judge adding 20 months to his already 5-year sentence for kidnapping Timothy White. The sentence, widely considered too short by the families, the victims, the judge, and legislators, for the time being signaled an end to the public ordeal for the Stayner and White families. But with time off for good behavior, Parnell would be free in the world once again, and everyone's greatest fear would come true. Parnell would try to hurt another child. This episode, we talk about the remaining years of Parnell's life in this episode of The Life and Kidnapping of Stephen Stayner, Parnell's Legacy. Welcome to California True Crime. I'm Jessica, and with me for this episode are Sean and Charles. How are you both doing?
I'm doing good.
Yeah, I'm great.
Good. So before we get started, we have an update and some people we want to thank. And first, we want to thank Janae, who just entered our $5 level on Patreon, which we really, really appreciate. She's been listening to us and following us for quite a long time, so she's one of our favorites. So thank you, Janae.
We'd also like to send out best wishes to one of the members of our Facebook discussion group, Brenda, who is currently laid up after an accident. We hope for a speedy recovery.
So just a warning on this episode, they've all been really tough in this series, but we will be talking later in this episode about some pretty difficult things with sexual abuse, so just a warning for people who are out there. It's been several long episodes, many more than we originally thought. I think the first episode of this series, I said it would be 3. So we were way off. I really appreciate everyone listening and following each episode. There will only be one more episode after this, so we'll be wrapping up everyone's life, letting you know what happened next to them, the people that we could find at least. And this episode, we'll be talking specifically about Murphy, Mathias, and mostly Parnell. Next episode, we will tell you about the lives of Timothy and Stephen and all the updates on laws, and we want to end talking about them. They're the most important part of this story. All of the information for this episode came from newspapers. We have put up our works cited list on the site. It's an ongoing list, so we're still adding to it because it's taken us a while to get everything on there. But all the articles would be there because none of these episodes would be possible without all of the work of the journalists and newspaper writing these articles to begin with. This episode, I continue to use articles from the Bay Area because eventually when Parnell gets out of jail, he'll settle there. So there's a lot of coverage, specifically for those newspapers. Last episode, we ended with Parnell and Murphy being found guilty of conspiracy to kidnap Stephen Stayner. Parnell received 20 months added on to his sentence of 5 years that he had received as punishment in the trial before.
And he initially receives the 5 years for solely kidnapping Timothy White.
Right.
And then the judge, because of the law, the judge hands out only 20 months for Stephen's kidnapping.
20 months extra.
20 months
that's
extra.
That's all that he can add on
That's
to.
only. So for kidnapping and abuse for 7 years, it's 20 months.
Right. If you remember, Murphy also received 5 years after that second trial. And after the trial, Murphy is sent to Soledad Correctional Training Facility to serve out the remainder of his sentence. The Soledad Correctional Training Facility is in Soledad, California, which is in Monterey County. In the newspapers, it's commonly called Soledad State Prison. Soledad is about 45 miles or so southeast of Monterey, California. This prison was originally associated with San Quentin and was built in 1946. It's a minimum to medium security prison that holds about 5,000 inmates. And it focuses mainly on rehabilitation and education for inmates. And this is something Murphy participates in while at Soledad. In 1982, when Murphy is sentenced, he has the opportunity to both earn time off his sentence for good behavior, as well as earn time for participating in prison work programs. And all the time he's been in jail waiting also counts towards his sentence. So Murphy was arrested on March 5th, 1980. So by the time he's sentenced in 1982, he's already been in jail for 2 years. This means that Murphy is paroled from Soledad State Prison in June of 1983, after serving a little over 3 years in jail. And he actually settles in Modesto, California, and he'll spend 1 year on probation. And in all the research I did, this is a time sort of before the internet, so he's never arrested for anything else. I don't think I couldn't find anything like that, but he kind of disappears in general, so I'm not sure what happens to him after he's left out of jail.
So you don't know if he's alive or dead?
Right.
Oh, okay.
There were some Murphys I found in the Central Valley who were the same age, but I'm not sure if that's him or what really happened to him. Before we move on to Parnell, I also wanted to follow up with Barbara Mathias. Barbara Mathias is never arrested for the crimes she committed against Stephen, and there isn't much more about her in the newspapers either. By the time this trial starts in 1981, Mathias had already lost one of her sons to murder and another to jail. And then in 1984, the San Francisco Examiner has a story about an interview they did with 2 inmates in jail. The inmates are named Robert Carbone and Robert Mathias. Robert Mathias is the son of Barbara Mathias, and he's in jail in California for drug and firearm charges, and an oral copulation charge. Robert Carbone is a friend of his who he met while in jail previously, another time that he was in jail, and the two say they spent a lot of time together, and particularly in Washington State. Robert Carbone was in jail for rape and assault. The two tell the San Francisco Examiner and the San Jose Mercury News that they contacted them because they have an important story to tell, and they hoped if the public knew their story, they might actually be protected in jail. According to the men, after they left prison, they met up at a bar in San Francisco on Polk Street and decided to go on a crime spree. They stole a car in San Francisco and headed north, finding themselves in Kings County, Washington. Kings County is in the northwestern part of Washington State, basically in the very tip of Washington's northern corner, and Seattle is the most well-known city from this county, and it's about 848 miles from San Francisco. Google Maps says it's about a 14-hour drive. On July 25th, once in Kings County, they say they picked up a young woman, posing as police, took her to the woods, and raped and murdered her. This, they say, is something they did at least 11 times with 11 women. The men say they targeted young, white women, mainly runaways and or sex workers, and pretended to be police each time. If this sounds familiar, it's because during this time, there were women who had been murdered and raped, with very similar descriptions in the same area, and police were on the hunt for a man they called the Green River Killer. The newspaper headlines indicate that Mathias and Carbone were admitting to being the Green River Killer, but in the articles, they were actually admitting to committing murders in the same area. When asked if he was the Green River Killer, Mathias responded in the Examiner that he wished he killed that many women. The police follow up on the information they give them, and it turns out the 2 men were in jail during most of the time they said they were murdering. It also seems that there wasn't evidence they were actually in Washington State. Both men are dangerous, and Carbone at least had committed more than one rape, but police did not think they were the Green River Killers, and Gary Ridgway is arrested for those crimes in 2001. In the Examiner, Mathias said that he murders women because of his mother, that he was sexually abused as a child and hated street people. This story lasts a couple of days that I can find, and the police determine that it's fake, or what they think is fake. These 2 men are also not the only men who come forward during this time and say they committed the murders in Washington and turn out to be lying. In the newspaper, Mathias also said that Kenneth Parnell molested him and blamed him for his turn to violence.
He's saying also that his mother molested him as well?
He didn't say his mother molested him, but he does seem to blame her for his anger towards women.
Okay.
So he's blaming ultimately both of them. It seems like he maybe lived with them for some time. I'm not sure. But he says that he was hurt by Parnell and blaming his mother.
Is this son one of the ones that was living with her while they were living in like the bus with Parnell and Stephen?
I don't believe the youngest one lived with them for a good amount of time. I don't believe it's him, but she has several kids, and the papers do say that some stayed with them at certain times and then left. So I assume that's what he's saying here.
And the police are saying that it's not.
They look into it, and they don't know who the Green River Killer is at this time. And like I said, in the articles, it says there are other people who also say they are the Green River Killer who turn out not to be true. But during the times that they say that they are hurting people, there actually no evidence that they're in Washington.
So them trying to get privilege in prison? Is this like they make this story up because they're already in prison so they can be in more protective custody? Is that what they're trying to do?
They tell the newspapers that that's the reason they're telling them, that they think if they just tell police, then police might hurt them. I guess assuming that they believe their story. I'm not sure why if they are lying, I'm not sure why they do that I don't know what the reason is.
Well, and the problem is assuming that story about the mom and Parnell, which given everything that we've talked about these episodes and what Stephen himself testified in open court about is true. You have the word of two people that by all intents and purposes are lying about all these other crimes.
Right. Although they both have committed some violent crimes.
Right. No, they're guilty of the crimes that they're in jail for. It's
right.
These additional 11 crimes.
And I mentioned this story because A, it's odd, but also B, it sort of shows the Parnell is sort of in a lot of.
It's another ripple effect of what I think we're all safe saying that's probably a true story, that Parnell abused.
The part where he hurt him.
Yeah, that he abused this kid.
That part's believable, yeah.
Right. Now, whether that had anything to do with contributing to his crimes later.
Parnell is someone who has always maintained his innocence throughout all these episodes. After he receives his punishment in the last kidnapping trial, he is sent, I believe, to Soledad State Prison as well. While in Soledad, Parnell is a good inmate. He works as a janitor and is kept in a protective housing unit. He is there during some of the time Murphy is there, but I don't know if they ever see each other or are in the same unit or anything like that. Parnell is kept in a protective unit because he's actually experienced violence in jail. Specifically during the trial for the crime of the kidnapping of Stephen, Parnell was assaulted at least once. He was bloodied and bruised but refused to tell police or jail officials who had done it to him. So this is an ongoing worry for people running the jail. While in jail, both his and Murphy's lawyer have filed appeals to the decision in the trials. When it's first filed, it's filed on the grounds that the statute of limitations had passed. So this same argument.
Yeah, that's weird that they just appeal their defense that just lost.
I think they're hoping the appeals court might see it differently, but it's just the argument that won't go away.
And that's legal. Even though the argument was struck down in one court, then they can bring it up again. And that, I guess that's the point of the appeal, saying that court was wrong. Take it to the higher court.
I mean, an appeals court has a choice to not look at the case and to deny it just by, getting the appeal. Right. But I mean, it is the job of the appeals court to kind of look through what a judge has decided and say, yes, this makes sense, or no, we need to look at this further. Or there are other cases where this is happening and not everyone's on the same page type thing. But while Parnell is in jail, a big decision is made by the California Supreme Court. In 1982, in People v. Shirley, the California Supreme Court makes a decision that really changes a lot of court cases. They decide that testimony gotten from someone who has been put under hypnosis cannot be used in a court of law. This decision isn't just applied to upcoming cases, but also retroactively. So as we said, hypnosis is a big deal in the 1980s, and it's used in a lot of cases.
We see it, we've talked about it before, but it is crazy about how many of these newspaper articles or when we were doing research cited specifically that a lot of police departments and law enforcement agencies had somebody that would go through quote unquote training to be a police hypnotist.
Right.
This is interesting to me because I think it's just growing up when we were, or not growing up, but like when we started learning about trials and true crime and stuff, I always thought hypnosis was just never allowed.
Right.
And then this is just 82, and it's saying that that's when they cut it.
Yeah, I kind of thought it was like I think it's common knowledge now, at least if you're listening to this podcast or you're into like researching crime or true crime, that polygraph is not allowed in courts because it's not an accurate test. But they'll allow hypnosis at this time. I think that, it's weird to me.
And just in Mendocino County, the person who hypnotized Timothy White, his name is Dick Finn, the newspaper says that this Kenneth Parnell case is the 23rd time they had used hypnosis in a case. So, I mean, this will apply to a lot of cases just in the places we've talked about.
And that's potentially can overturn all of those convictions.
Right, it could, yeah. Immediately, the lawyer in Parnell's appeal, he refiles the document with additional addendum on the grounds that Timothy White was hypnotized and the decision in the case should be thrown out. The cases that are at most at risk of having their guilt or innocence reversed are cases where hypnotized witnesses are the main source of evidence. So in this case, in the case that's before the Supreme Court, the main source of evidence is the witness who was hypnotized, and that person remembers a lot of the details that they testify to from hypnosis. In this case, Timothy White was hypnotized. They say it was to find Sean Poorman, so it didn't really affect his memory, but his testimony isn't the only thing that convicts Kenneth Parnell. There's still, Poorman's testimony and Stephen's testimony. So in Mendocino, they feel like this will still stand, but it becomes a chance.
But if I'm a defense attorney, I'm gonna grab at whatever straw I have. And on the surface, those cases are very similar. Both witnesses hypnotized before the trial, recall things of which later they both testify to in open court.
Yeah, I would say the one difference is also, it does seem like Timothy, a lot of the stuff I find out about what Timothy is saying, what he's remembering, seems like it's the same, at least in the newspaper, before as in after.
Yeah, he was an extremely reliable witness to the point where he had to constantly remind the police and law enforcement that he was telling the truth.
Which you can be hypnotized, and then the things you remember can feel stronger. You can feel more belief that those things are real. So sometimes someone feeling like they're telling the truth isn't exactly mean that they are. But in this case, I think there's very little to do with the hypnotism. I can understand in some other cases what might be more of an issue.
And there's a whole question about false memories and...
Yeah. But this case, they think, like we said, that it shouldn't affect it. But there's always that chance. This decision will also have the effect of changing how cases going forward work. Mendocino County, for instance, has to think about scaling back their use of hypnotism. Dick Finn, who hypnotized Timothy White, isn't at all happy with the verdict. He says that it's an invaluable tool, and there are many cases, particularly assault or molestation cases, that they've only been able to bring charges because of hypnotism. And in the Ukiah Daily Journal, it says that Finn spent 4 days in 1978 being trained at the Law Enforcement Hypnosis Institution in Los Angeles before he starts hypnotizing. So this is something, again, the lawyer in this case thinks that he can bring up and use to get...
The fact that there was actually an organization which trains law enforcement.
Yeah, there's a huge... LA is one of the biggest... I think it's known as the biggest place. They had a whole force of hypnotists. It's a pretty amazing story. Hopefully we can cover that.
But I think the main point of that was that you only spend 4 days learning.
Yeah.
Well, I know in our research, one of our excursions to the library and our diving into the microfiche, I saw a couple of instances where there were sheriff's deputies that went through like a half-hour course and then got a certificate. And so
it's like me becoming a minister online for 15 minutes.
Right. $5. I got my license as well, actually.
In the end, the court denies Parnell's appeal, but it is a good reminder that despite the trial being over and Parnell's in jail, there's still things that come up and the media gets back involved, and the Stayner family and the White family have to worry again about what might happen, and it's just a lot of stress.
Because I'm assuming as soon as that comes up into the news, that's going to send all of these reporters and people back to the Stayner's family.
Yeah, I don't know for sure, but just having it in the news and your names attached to it and people asking those questions, and then the possibility that Parnell might actually get out. This is just, it's a lot too. It's like it never ends, really. Parnell continues in jail until 1985, when because of good behavior and days worked in jail, he earns his release from prison. News that Parnell will soon be released from jail spreads across California, and people become rightly very upset. Parnell has spent less time in jail than the 7 years he held Stephen Stayner. In the Napa Valley Register, Stephen is quoted, quote, "If he gets time off for good behavior, he'll be in prison less time than I spent away from my family."
So all told, he gets sentenced in 81.
Right.
Goes to prison, or 82.
82, yeah, the very beginning of 82.
So very beginning of 82. It's now 85. He spent roughly 3 years in prison.
Plus the time during
the trial.
Yeah. It goes by fast.
Yeah, I can't. I know we've said it repeatedly, but it's still shocking.
Also, communities around California, and especially Merced and Mendocino, do not want Parnell to be able to show up in their communities. And this isn't the only case like this at the time. In the early 1980s, there are several high-profile prisoners released from prison. And much of California is outraged that people who are a danger to children and adults would be let out. So at the same time this is going on, people like Lawrence Singleton, Raymond George, and rapist Philip Bunyard. And in at least one instance, the governor steps in and keeps an inmate in jail for longer than his sentence because of the outrage. Lawrence Singleton was also housed outside the jail after being let out because of all the anger. And I mean, he does go on to commit another crime, and a terrible one. After learning about Parnell's imminent release, the district attorney in Merced urged the Mendocino County DA to bring charges against Parnell for molestation of Stephen Stayner. After Parnell's trial for Stephen's kidnapping, the fact that Parnell never answered for the sex crimes angered a lot of people. And the DA in Merced, if you remember, he tries to bring charges a couple of times, and they keep getting dismissed for a lack of evidence. And this isn't something just new to now. He's been asking Mendocino to do this for some time. But now it seems more important because Parnell is getting out, and they're worried about what he'll do and if he'll hurt another child. Also, from what is written about this case, most of the instances of sexual assault took place in Mendocino, so the Halford, the DA in Merced, wants them to try and bring these charges there in hopes that them being brought there, that means they'll stick this time. The DA in Mendocino County looks into bringing charges, but can only do so if there's enough evidence, and that would rely heavily again on the testimony of Stephen Stayner. When the DA contacts the Stayner family to see if Stephen would be a cooperative witness, the Stayners have a lot of questions. Last episode, we talked about how once the verdict was read in the trial, the Stayner family really made a decision to try and get back to their life and build a new one. So for them, this is a really big decision. And in a lot of crimes in California, a DA can subpoena a victim to testify even if they don't want to. My understanding, though, is that in California, sex crimes are an exception to this. So anybody who's listening and wondering.
So that means that if I'm a victim of molestation and the DA comes and says, we're subpoenaing you, I can say, no, I don't want to. And
I don't even think he or she can issue a subpoena.
Oh, really?
Right.
Oh, okay.
Under the law.
I have to I have to go to the DA and say, I am willing to testify.
Yeah, like in this case, she's going to talk with the family and they'll discuss, the good reasons to do it or what might happen.
But no formal subpoena.
Right. She'll respect their wishes. The issue for the Stayner family is that the DA can't guarantee the number of charges that they can get a conviction for. So it could be 0. They could go through all of this, a trial, and it could be 0. It could be 1. It could be hundreds. So the amount of extra time that Parnell could receive is variable, and they have to weigh the effect it will have on their and Stephen's life versus the outcome.
Yeah, it seems like they didn't even stick around for the sentencing. They were done when they said guilty. I don't see why they would even want to try. They're done with this. And I understand it's for the better to put a bad man away, but they've already been through so much. And
they tried too. I think that's the other heartbreaking thing too, is if they'd had evidence or before it got close, that argument had already been shut down once by it.
Right, because you think about it, how they thought he was going to get 25 years.
Right.
And they leave, they're already done before he's sentenced, and then when he's sentenced to 20 months, they're probably just like, screw this. We're completely done. And
I think this is the same as a lot of victims would feel. You have to think about what it's worth it for you, and there would be different answers for everybody, and that's true for the Stayner family.
And none of them are wrong, too. We've said that a lot, but people have to deal with these tragedies in their own, and none of us sitting here listening can understand what that family had went through.
Yeah, they're surviving. Everyone in the story is surviving, and whatever that looks like for them is what it looks like. That's just whether it makes sense to you or how you would do it has nothing to do with it.
And no one has a right to judge those people except, no one, really.
Right. In the Ukiah Daily Journal, Kay Stayner says, quote, "They could not guarantee enough extra time for Parnell. They just said there was a possibility of more than 20 years or less than 5. Given that these would be the same charges that were dismissed a couple of times by judges, there's also the consideration that everything gets brought back out for nothing. Also, in the Napa Valley Register article from 1983, Kay Stayner says that the press had started to leave them alone. So finally in 83, they had left requests for them. They'd kind of gone away. So they have to take that into consideration too.
That's 3 years. 3 years of constantly being hounded.
Right. Do they want to get back into that? In the end, the family and the district attorney decide not to not to bring charges. So Joe Allen, the DA in Mendocino County, he had wanted them to be able to bring charges against Parnell, but he also knew that it would be a difficult experience to have all that brought up again. And one of the things we haven't discussed, because it doesn't come up here, is civil trials. Victims have access to suing someone who's hurt them. And in this case, Parnell would be the person who would be sued here. And there are some programs in place for this around California and in counties when it comes to victims of sexual crime. We'll put all of that on our site. You can find information about that on RAIN, as well as the California Department of Justice, and each local county also has people who should be able to answer questions about that. So we'll have all that on our site for you. Parnell is set to be released in April of 1985. According to state law, the way this would normally work is prisoners are released to the county or town where they committed the crime. Generally, people commit crimes in places they live. This changes in cases where someone has committed a crime in a place they don't live. Maybe they were driving through and decided to commit a crime. Maybe they even went to another town to specifically commit that crime, but they wouldn't be released back into that county. The main goal is to give released prisoners the best chance of not committing another crime. So releasing them somewhere where they know people or even have a place to live, maybe even a job, people that they know, is a better situation than just releasing them somewhere random where they don't know people. It also keeps one county or another from absorbing all the released prisoners. So one city, even if the jail's there, people don't want all of the prisoners to be released there. There are some reasons, however, where they wouldn't release a prisoner back in that same county. One is if a prisoner has a job waiting for them in another county. It makes the most sense to put them where they're going to have the most success. The state also takes into consideration the parolee's needs. If, for instance, they need certain counseling services when they get out, then they need to be in a county that has those, and not every county in California does. The other instance in which they wouldn't be released into the same county they committed the crime in is in a high-profile case, or if there's a need to protect the safety and life of victims and witnesses. This is obviously one of those cases. In any other circumstance, Parnell would be released back to Mendocino County, but this is a dangerous premise for him. Just hearing about his release, he receives death threats. So releasing him in either Merced or Mendocino is a bad idea for everyone, but he does have to go somewhere.
Is this why Murphy ended up in Modesto?
There's not as much information on Murphy as there is on this, so I don't even know if he has the same, because Parnell will have some conditions to his release, and I imagine it's the same because they committed the same crime, but I'm not really sure. When the State Department Board of Corrections looks at places to make this decision of where they're going to put someone, they look at places that have the possibility for someone to get a job. They look for places with affordable housing. They take into account the police force and how good they are, stuff like that. As such, the State Department Board of Corrections decides that Alameda County is the best place for Parnell to be released. The Board of Corrections does not have to take into consideration the county or its preferences. And the Alameda County supervisors, the city council, and local police all lodge a complaint with the Board of Corrections. When Parnell is released, the Board of Corrections does not tell the public where Parnell is being located. Police are told in general when individuals are released from prison that they're going to be coming to their area. They notify them a few days in advance, but they usually only get about 3 days, according to the paper. And in fact, when the police in the area want to notify people that Parnell is coming to live there, they are stopped because it's actually against the law for them to do so. And Parnell himself, after he's released a short time, because people get very upset about him being in their community, he will write a letter to the Sacramento Bee defending his release to that area. And part of that letter reads, quote, "Releasing me from prison was the right thing as a fact since I had served the required sentence. Some people might be reminded that I received the maximum sentence under the law and might find comfort that although I have completed the sentences given me by the court, I still remain on parole." So he writes that to the Sacramento Bee to, I guess, convince people.
He's very pompous. It's not very convincing.
Notice at no time does he say, "I'm innocent. I didn't do the crime. It's I fulfilled the requirements of my sentence."
He passed the test.
I can't yet. But again, we've talked a lot about the idea that Parnell is very manipulative and trying to get people on his side and play that up.
And he's been successful.
Yeah.
I can imagine, we saw what happened when he testified in the first trial, and I can understand why the lawyer in his second trial convinced him not to, even though he really wanted to. I'm not sure he's his best representative.
No, but I can 100% understand that letter. That letter makes total sense that he would have wrote that on his release. Like, see, look, I'm out. I did my time. I deserve to be poor me.
Yeah. And it's not that it's not factual. I mean, all the things he says are true, but it's just not going to make anyone feel any better.
Being him,
yeah.
If I was him, I would not be writing a letter saying, "Hey, I'm out, guys." You know?
No. Especially, yeah. Any person that did this crime wouldn't do that. On top of which, you are nationally known. You know, that's like putting a signpost up.
On the day of his parole, Parnell was given $200, a new set of clothes, and transported to an unknown residence where he will live. The town in Alameda County they settle him in is Berkeley, California. Berkeley is in the Bay Area and part of the East Bay. In 2018, it had about 121,000 people living there. It sits directly on the San Francisco Bay. UC Berkeley is in Berkeley as well. Berkeley also has, for me, one of the best parks if you're into kite flying, which it happens I am. It's called Cesar Chavez Park. And this park is actually built on top of a landfill and is a wetland. And there's a lot of stuff to see there. It sits right on the water. It's really pretty, and dogs really like it as well. So if you're looking for something to do in Berkeley. In the San Francisco Examiner on April 6, 1987, one of the reasons they settled Parnell in Berkeley was, quote, "We thought Berkeley was a progressive and tolerant kind of city that could handle that kind of case." Parnell is put into a boarding house. Parnell will be on parole for 3 years and is expected to check in with the parole officer 3 to 4 times a week, at least at first. Under the conditions of his parole, Parnell cannot leave Alameda County without getting permission from his parole officer. He has to attend therapy once a week, something he did in jail, but it doesn't sound like he really participated. It's noted that Parnell never expressed remorse in prison and never talked about the crime. Parnell is also banned from going into Merced or Mendocino counties during his 3-year parole. He also can't be near minors and must register as a sex offender in the county he settles in, so in Alameda County. In 1985, the sex offender registry is not a statewide public registry as it is now. That doesn't actually happen until about 1996 or so. It has changed a bit from the registry we talked about in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, although not necessarily because the registry changes, but because the laws regarding certain kinds of sex acts change. In California, a law called Consenting Adults was passed in 1975, and it was a big part of getting rid of the sexual psychopath laws in California. It had the effect of decriminalizing sexual acts between adults over the age of 18. The other thing that really starts to change the sex offender registry is several high-profile kidnapping cases and murder cases across the country. Most of our laws, based at least on what we've researched so far, seems to be in reaction to events. The high penalty, for instance, for kidnappers who take someone for ransom are put on the books because of several high-profile cases that angered people. So as the 1980s starts, there are several cases of children being kidnapped. In California, as in much of the rest of the country, that fear takes hold, and we start the Stranger Danger program. And in the late 1980s, several organizations in California start. When Parnell is released, several organizations in the area talk with the press. One is called the Protect Your Child, Inc. in San Lorenzo. Another is called the Kevin Collins Foundation for Missing Children in San Francisco. Kevin Collins is a little boy who went missing in San Francisco. So these are unfortunately, like a lot of the organizations we've talked about, are started because of terrible crimes. But these are also organizations that didn't exist when we started talking about these episodes.
So even though his prison sentence was criminally short,
right,
he's coming into a different world than when he left.
Absolutely, yeah. There's a lot more, I think people are more aware of these kinds of kidnappings or of kidnappings in general. And like I said, these other kidnappings that happen, the Kevin Collins one, Polly Klaas will happen after Parnell is out. These are big, they're big stories, they're everywhere, and people are talking about it. And there are these organizations that all weigh in on what should be happening with someone like Parnell.
So we're now starting to move into that moment where we talked a lot about that. A lot of this case happened before advocacy for the victims, where these groups are taking part of that
Right.
role as an advocate for the victims. They're also, a lot of these groups, their main function is to keep the story in the news and keep people talking about it. And it seems like by this point, when Parnell's released, that 24-hour news cycle, CNN, headline news, they're starting to mature and come into their own. And more people are used to having a dedicated news feed.
Yeah, and we won't talk about some of the laws that will get passed. We'll do that next episode, but that's all happening at the same time. They're keeping stories in the press, but they're doing that to push a lot of laws. So we're seeing things that are happening for the first time, like a fingerprinting of kids, huge movements to make sure counties are doing that and people giving money for that purpose. And I mean, stranger danger is something we've talked a little bit about, and some of it was ridiculous, but a lot of it is based on things that we come to take as normal now, but didn't really exist at the time.
Going back to Parnell's letter, I mean, he probably got the news, watched the news in jail. That might have been because of these organizations. He's like, look, I did my time. Leave me alone now that I'm out, because he knows things have been changed.
Yeah, and the other thing that's happened is not just with Parnell, but with a few other inmates, is they become the face of trying to change laws to make them better, of people getting out, because he's not the only one. There are some murderers who get out at the same time, and people don't want them in that area. So they become kind of the boogeyman in a way. Here's a person you can see. He didn't get the years he deserved. He's back on the streets. The chances, I think we would all agree, of him committing another crime is high just because of what he's done so far. And because criminal justice reform becomes such a huge part in California and the country, people really have that at the top of their list. It all gets mixed in together.
And seeing his pictures, I mean, he is kind of scary looking. So, yeah. I mean, it is an easy face to use as this is the boogeyman.
Right. Don't talk to strangers. This is the person that you're afraid of.
Right.
Which, I mean, again, going back to statistics that we've talked a lot about during this entire arc, chances of a child being assaulted or kidnapped by a random stranger are so low, they're almost non-existent.
Right, and this is what happens when he's let out of jail. He is asked to be on the sex registry for the county, but he is considered a low-risk offender. He's not someone, because he hasn't been, since that first time in Bakersfield, I don't even know how many years ago it is now from where we are, but decades ago, he hasn't been convicted of a sexual assault or of hurting kids in that way. So he's considered a low-risk offender, which rightly upsets people.
Right.
But you're also right, because he isn't even the most common kind of person you're going to see on the sex registry. So people start to make laws around some of the bigger cases, even though the bigger cases aren't as statistically as likely as some of the smaller things. You being hurt by someone you know.
Instead of, again, and we've talked about this when we talked about stranger danger. That's the bad side of that coin. Is you're telling kids to be worried about strangers and don't talk to strangers. You're not educating them in what to do if a personal friend or a trusted adult does something. And on that same side, you have Parnell, who is 100% going to do something terrible. But since his only conviction was decades and decades and decades ago, he's considered low risk.
And we've talked about the ways this story, I think, like you just brought up, is similar to a lot of people's experiences. And we'll go over that when we talk about Stephen's life tomorrow. But even Stephen talks about that later in life, that this was more like a father hurting a son.
Right.
And is really common with far too many people. The thing that we haven't talked about is the one thing that makes it different, and that is Parnell. So based on all the numbers we've shared with you, a large amount of people are victims of sex crimes. However, not all sex crimes are committed by someone like Parnell, which is to say that many sex crimes, even ones committed against children, are not committed by a pedophile. And we're going to define some of these terms because we haven't really talked about it, and it doesn't get talked about, I think, enough. And there's a lot of myths and ideas about predators and people who commit these crimes, and not talking about it, I think, means that some of those myths and stereotypes get pushed onto victims. So pedophilia is a type of paraphilia. A paraphilia, according to the American Psychiatric Association Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Disorders and a Psychology Today article, is sexual behavior that is atypical and extreme. We talked before about psychology's aim at identifying disorders. So this disorder would include anything that harms, disrupts your life, or harms another. Often a paraphilia can be something considered not necessarily disorder, something regular, a sexual behavior, but if it's taken to the extreme and becomes disruptive to your life, it becomes a disorder. Pedophilia is a paraphilia that involves a persistent sexual attraction to prepubescent children. Prepubescent is defined as a child generally 13 years or under. In the past, pedophilia, in order to be diagnosed or recognized as a paraphilia, would also have to be acted on and a crime committed, because this limited strategies aimed at helping people who have these sexual urges but hadn't acted on them, that part was dropped. This category includes fantasizing, sexual urges, acting on those urges, and understanding of the whys and hows are limited in part because it is rare for people to seek help for this paraphilia. For obvious reasons, there's a stigma attached to it. It is believed that only about 3% of the population has this paraphilia, and statistically, more men than women. There are also some myths and misunderstandings around pedophilia. It's often considered that a pedophile will have a specific age that they either victimize or are attracted to, but that doesn't necessarily have to be the case. In fact, early in these episodes, we talked about a doctor back east who had victimized, he was a pediatrician, had victimized a town. And in that story, he victimized children of all ages and any gender. So there doesn't have to always be an attraction to a specific gender. But a lot of this, as we said, is limited because of our understanding of what's happening. And this is a topic with little research, at least based on how prevalent sex abuse is. Approximately 40% of all sex crimes committed against children are done so by pedophiles, meaning about 60% of crimes aren't committed by someone with this paraphilia. Sometimes these are crimes of opportunity, crimes of power, which we often hear people talk about, rape and molestation being about power. And there are different ways that plays. There isn't always a physical power issue. We've talked a lot about in this podcast how kids have less social power than adults. Women sometimes have less social power than men. Different races, socioeconomic status, that all plays into that kind of power relationship. And there are difficulties with understanding this entire thing because not only do people not come forward and participate in studies or share with researchers that they are pedophiles and they haven't committed a crime, but victims often don't come forward. There's a huge swath. They think about maybe 38% of crimes committed against children are never reported. So that leaves us with a difficulty with statistics as well. We don't know exactly what's happening in those cases. Parnell, though, it's fair to say, is a pedophile. It's definitely not our job to diagnose or even label people, but newspapers up until his death call him a sexual psychopath. And knowing the loaded and misleading term historically that is, plus his kidnapping and treatment of children, I think we can use that here accurately. And I mainly mention all of this here because I realized we hadn't talked about what a pedophile is. And we've talked a lot about victims and we've talked a lot about what they go through. And while I think it's really important to talk about cases like we have in this series, because as trite as it sounds, knowledge is power. And if we want to better understand victims and understand the issues around sexual assault that continue to be issues for victims, talking about those and pointing them out are important. So talking about what a pedophile is and pointing out how they do hurt people, but also pointing out how a big portion of these crimes are committed by people who aren't pedophiles is also important. Parnell is awful. Zero reservations about saying this. But he isn't just the face of molestations or of abuse or rape. And if we want to go further and work towards a greater understanding of sex crimes in the hopes of stopping them, it's important to find a greater understanding in all of these issues. And if that means understanding through research or for professionals, the people who commit these crimes, then I think that's important to do.
Hi, we're the hosts of the Fresh Hell podcast. I'm Annie in Boston, Massachusetts.
And I'm Johanna in Vienna, Austria. Join us every Wednesday for a new terrible story.
I focus mostly on cases in the United States, and not just true crime like the terrifying axe murders on Smutty Nose Island, but also shocking stories like the New Jersey shark attacks of 1916.
And I love to tell you about more obscure European cases. And let me tell you, Germany has produced more cannibals than one would think.
So if you're a fan of true crime, but you also enjoy terrible stories of all sorts, give us a listen. We'll tell you everything you need to know and then some.
Come find Fresh Hell Podcast on your favorite podcast platform. Auf Wiedersehen.
Hope to see you soon.
The other difference between Parnell and most people on the sex registry, which is actually why I think it's good that he has to register, although I have varied feelings on how well that registry works, is the likelihood of him committing another crime. There are issues with the sex offense registry and how it works, and for our listeners, ideas about this I'm sure will vary, but I think our idea about the average person on the registry, as we said, is someone who has hurt children, is a pedophile, and will commit another act, and this really isn't accurate. The truth is that Parnell is an outlier. So his crimes and the way that Stephen was abused and the feelings that he has, those aren't necessarily outliers because they happen to so many people. But Parnell himself, the crimes he committed, the way he did them, those are outliers. And based on everything we've talked about, Parnell seems like someone with a high chance of committing another crime, just based on the crimes we know he's already committed. However, among people who have committed sex offenses, based on several studies, including information from the California Department of Justice, which is where I actually got a lot of the stats that I just used before as well, the recidivism rate is 3 to 5%. So the recidivism is the chance that they'll do it again. It only really happens in about 3 to 5% of cases. So despite the fact that 1 in every 400 Californians have made it onto the sex registry, many of them for nonviolent crimes, most of them will never commit another sex crime.
That's weird to me because I feel like there's been so much talk constantly, kind of like Stranger Danger, how you always hear about it, that there's no helping a pedophile. There's no help. These types of crimes, they'll always commit it again. But hearing a 3 to 5% is different than what you're told all the time.
Remember, that's anybody on the sex registry. So that is like the vast majority of them aren't. We're not talking about pedophiles. We're talking about anybody that gets on the sex registry. Am I understanding that correctly?
Right. But in my research, when I was researching the issue of pedophilia and the paraphilia, what I saw, and there still needs to be a lot of research done into that because they just don't understand what's happening there, but that even in those situations where someone is an actual pedophile, there are plenty, apparently, researchers say, people who don't commit sex crimes at all, never act on those urges, and that there is still a pretty low recidivism rate among that group, according to researchers. Now, there still needs to be a lot of research done, but I think part of like what you're saying, in my mind, we have an idea of who's on the registry. This, like you're saying, it's an evil person who's hurt kids, it's a rapist who's going to definitely do it again. And this isn't going to help people because there are plenty of cases to point to, famous cases especially, where someone does commit another crime. So it's not going to make anyone who is the victim of those feel better, obviously. It's a difficult conversation to have. The question is, what do we do with the other 95, 96, 7% of people who aren't going to commit those crimes again? And once you're on the sex registry in California has the strictest law in the nation. You're on it for life. And even kids can be on the sex registry. One of the things I saw was a kid as young as 9 be put on the sex registry. And that person is on it for his entire life.
Was it for a violent offense?
I don't know because
it's closed.
Right. And children who commit sex crimes, kids usually under the age of 16 or 14, are a significant portion of the sex crimes that are committed. That doesn't really have much to do with what we're talking about here, so I will put some information on our website about it. There are organizations and researchers working to find ways to help children. There's a lot of different. It's a whole thing, but there's even a TED Talk about it. So, of a woman who's working with kids and finding ways to rehabilitate them and get them going. So we'll have that all on our site.
It seems like, too, that our discussion of this and really throughout all of these episodes has been that no one is really talking about in any meaningful way about what's going on, the sexual abuse. And we were still talking in 2019 that people are afraid to come forward. It's getting better now. I think I would like to think that it's getting better. People are more open to talk about it and seek help. but it's still going on. We're not finding good solutions to help. And it's reminiscent of what you talked about early, and I think our first episode on this case of Stephen Stayner, that it's reminiscent of what progressives during the progressive era tried to put into place for rehabilitation. And those things that were put in place for rehabilitation really did a lot more harm than good.
And that's going to be an issue throughout all of these decades with changing ideas. And there's still stereotypes and myths which guide our thinking, and then fear, which makes things even worse. We'll talk a lot about this next episode when we talk about the new criminal laws that are put into place. But I think part of it is it's lots of people who want to help. You want to keep what happens to Stephen Stayner or Poly class from happening again. But you also want to do that in a way that doesn't harm people who can be rehabilitated. And how you do that, I think we're going to find a lot of laws throughout all these episodes that hurt people and don't do the thing they're aimed at. And sometimes I don't know if that's even something we can help.
No, and I think it goes back to when making a law, especially a law like this, like that have to do with violence against children, or violence in general. Any law I want to protect the victim and help them. I want to punish the guilty, but I still want a law that allows for mercy and rehabilitation. And in this story, I think, like you said, there have been moments when something is put in place to try to better things and didn't work correctly, but there was no movement to go back and change it.
And a lot of the episodes we've done have directly challenged the way I feel about things. And Parnell is another one for me that does that, because I think the list and the registry is political, and a lot of people have ideas about it. And depending on the things you've experienced, if you've experienced trauma or rape yourself, you would definitely feel differently about it than maybe I do. But Parnell is someone who we know he's going to try and hurt someone else again. And he's hurt several people horribly, and he's probably committed crimes that he's never been convicted of, victims we don't even know. So for me, I don't know what to do with that, because he shouldn't be around kids or on the street. He's scary.
Yeah.
And he's hard to create laws for.
And I think that's the hard one too, is because it's so many times we see these laws. And as a layperson, we've made pretty public that we are not lawyers. We don't work in law enforcement. We're three people that love researching and discussing this stuff. But it's hard when you look at these laws. And my gut reaction is one way, and then after really thinking about it, I start to see myself shift. Like you said, this is as much research as you have done mainly, and Sean and I have chimed in when we can. It has not been comfortable. This whole discussion, especially this one on what should be done with people that commit these crimes, and how long is too long on the registry, and is the registry even a good thing? I mean, Parnell was on the registry since the 40s, and it didn't stop him committing crimes. It didn't stop him from doing what he did to Stephen and kidnapping Timothy.
The registry is complicated, and I honestly didn't mean for us to get into a deep conversation about it. It does change in 2017. The California government passed Senate Bill 384, which changes the registry to now distinguish perpetrators by the crime they committed and its severity. That will begin in 2021, and according to the SF Gate, could affect about 90% of people on the registry.
But it still means that I'm on it for life, though, regardless.
No.
That hasn't changed?
It does change. Crimes in 2021, crimes will be separated into tiers. Tier 1 will be crimes that are nonviolent and require people to register for 10 years instead of a lifetime. And then if you don't recommit that offense, you'll be able to come off the registry. The tier 2 are crimes that are more serious and require a 20-year registry. And tier 3 are the more serious and will still carry a lifetime registry. So it's a way to try and delineate these crimes, because I think living in California, we've all heard stories of someone who urinated in public and ended up on the list. And then Parnell is, raping kids and he's on the list. And then there's just this huge variation in the crimes that are committed. So we'll add some more information on our site for people who are interested in those changes. So when Parnell is released from jail, as we said, he's put on the registry, but only in Alameda County, and mainly just for police. It's not public. After his release, Parnell doesn't commit any crimes, at least that the public or police know about during his parole. His parole ends in 1988, and when this happens, all the restrictions that came with his parole fall away. He's no longer restricted to Alameda County. He can leave and go wherever he wants to. He doesn't need permission. He also doesn't have to continue to check in with a parole officer. I think he does have to keep law enforcement in Alameda apprised of where he lives. But the main fear when his parole ends is that he now is no longer banned from traveling to Merced or Mendocino County.
He does still have to register.
Right, in Alameda County, yeah.
Okay.
But just in Alameda County.
As far as I know, yeah.
So that means Parnell could, in theory...
Unless he moves to another county, then he'll have to register in that county.
In that county.
Right, yeah.
So then Parnell could, move to Merced, to right next door to the Stayners, register with Merced County, and that's 100% okay.
Legal. Yeah.
Legal.
This scares the people of these counties for obvious reasons. Death threats are again made against Parnell's life. For instance, in the LA Times in April 1988, one of the titles of the articles is, quote, "Freed kidnapper a marked man if he returns to site of crimes." And newspapers across California run articles saying that now that Parnell's parole is up, he actually has plans to go to Mendocino. The source of these articles appears to be a man named Mike Eccles. We haven't talked about Eccles. He's actually the person who wrote the material for the screenplay for the movie, I Know My First Name is Steven, and then wrote the book that followed. In doing these episodes, I did not use the book for reasons we'll talk about next episode, so we'll have some time to get into it. According to newspapers, Mike Eccles is living in Colorado at this time, and he contacted the press to tell them that he's been communicating with Parnell and that this move to Mendocino is something Parnell told him about. He tells the LA Times that he has correspondence from Parnell that talks about his planned return. The newspaper does not say if it saw these communications, but they report what Eccles tells them, and Eccles also says that Parnell had been working as a short order cook and dishwasher. The parole board comes out and disputes Eccles' reports of what Parnell has been doing. They say he hasn't been working at all, that he's been getting help from organizations around the area. I know at one point, Parnell actually worked as an assistant to a pastor and at a teen, after-school program. I know. So,
what?
But I've never seen anything that said that he did this. And the parole board specifically says he isn't working as a dishwasher or a short order cook. And they don't say, the parole board doesn't know whether he has plans to move to Mendocino, but if I'm just reading too much into it, but I took the parole board even saying anything as a way of disputing all of what Mike Eccles was saying. Parnell does not appear to move to Mendocino ever, or anywhere else for that matter, because in 2003, Parnell is once again arrested for a crime very similar to the ones he's committed before. He's arrested for trying to purchase a child in an apartment complex on Matthews Street. Parnell approached a woman who sometimes helped him and asked her if she would help him purchase a young child. This was not a single conversation, but a conversation, or rather a request that he makes to her several times.
So he approaches this woman and just flat out asks, "Hey, I'd like to purchase a child?"
So apparently, as Parnell ages, because he's in his 70s at this point, he gets some in-home help. And her brother had been someone who had worked in his home and helped him through illnesses and things like that. So it's someone who knows him. She comes by every now and then and gives him help, I think. And so he sees her. He called her on the phone a couple of times. But yeah. And I don't know. I mean, this is something he's done before. He had other people help him get a child. So maybe he thinks he's found someone else.
We've established that he has a skill for getting people to do what he wants.
Right. Or finding people
people that would be more malleable. I mean, he gets Murphy to kidnap a kid.
Right. So he asks her many times over, I don't know exactly what the period of time is, but she doesn't turn him in right away, which I've seen other people say maybe she wanted to do it or was involved, but I just think it was a request. He's old. It seemed ridiculous to her. She's older. He's sick. It's just one of those things someone says to you and you don't take it seriously, or it's so unbelievable.
You almost
it doesn't
laugh
even
it off.
Permeate. Yeah.
Right. Just, oh yeah, haha. Her point might be he might be a touch senile, and
Do you know if she knows his past?
I assume that she does. Yeah. And this is around the time I believe she also saw in the movie it replayed again. the I Know My Name is Steven movie. So she's aware who he is, as are a lot of people in Berkeley. He lives in an apartment complex. And when he gets arrested, there's a lot of people who just don't understand why he's even being arrested. He's older. He can't hurt anyone, that kind of thing.
Yeah. Hypothetically, what if he like did it as like, hey, help me, or like a joke.
Yeah.
And to see how she would react, and it's like, because he's a huge manipulator.
Like laying the groundwork. Like,
right.
Oh, no. I was just joking.
And
but if you're interested.
Yeah, but if she didn't turn him in.
Right,
so then he actually tries.
And she does talk with her husband and her sister, who I think is a nurse, before, like, has conversations with them before deciding what to do. Because I really think she just isn't sure this is a real thing. Specifically, Parnell tells her that he'll give her $500 if she can get him a 4 to 6 year old African-American boy who speaks English with a birth certificate. He also requests some very specific things, according to a CNN article, which we won't repeat here. The woman will eventually agree to help Parnell, and she says that she does this because she's afraid. He's asked so many times that if she doesn't agree, if she says no, that he'll find someone else who does before she can talk to police. In December 2002, the police record the woman's phone and have a conversation between her and Parnell. During this conversation, the police have her tell Parnell that she's acquired a boy and will be delivering him and the birth certificate later. Parnell agrees to give her $100 for the birth certificate and the rest of the money when she delivers the boy. The police set the woman up with a wire, and she goes to Parnell's house to deliver the birth certificate. She gives him the certificate, and Parnell gives her the $100. And then, according to an appeals document I found, he leaves the room because of nerves and asks the woman to get the child and put him on his bed. The police arrest Parnell and find $400 more in his pocket, as well as various things around the house, including child pornography, children's clothing, a teddy bear, condoms, and some sexual aids. At the time of his arrest, he is 71 years old, and he is held in Santa Rita Jail in Dublin, California. Santa Rita is a jail he's been in before, although now he's being held in a more modern facility as overcrowding forced the jail to build a new facility in 1989. Parnell is held on $150,000 bail for the charges of conspiracy to commit child stealing, conspiracy to hold a person in involuntary servitude, and solicitation to commit a felony crime. The bigger issue for Parnell is a law passed in 1994 by both the legislature and the electorate called California's Three Strikes Law. This law was enacted because of anger over repeat offenders. What is specifically changed is how much time someone receives for being found guilty of committing a second or third felony, with the hopes that the extended prison sentences will keep people from committing crimes, especially violent ones, or that felons who seem to be unable to stop committing crimes will spend less time on the streets. We will link on our site an explanation of this crime and how it works from the California Legislative's Analyst's Office, and they have a really great chart which shows how the law changes, specifically certain sentences, so you can compare them from before to now. For Parnell, who has already been convicted of 3 felonies, including his first crime, he's now facing life in prison. And it's interesting because today, this law has been changed a little bit, it's been modified in the last few years. But at the time, there are people who think the Three Strikes Law is unfair because a lot of people are going to jail for life. We've probably all heard these stories for felonies that aren't violent crimes. And that's particularly the point they make, that if you haven't committed a violent crime, you shouldn't be spending life in jail. And Parnell, in articles about the 3 strikes, in arguments, becomes kind of the face of that because Parnell has not committed a violent crime other than his first one. And so if they change the law to not include violent crimes, someone like Parnell wouldn't get the 3 strikes. He wouldn't be put in jail.
But he's not been, can we say he's not been convicted?
Right, that's true. He has done them. He just hasn't been convicted.
He's committed these violent crimes.
But that's what the law takes into account, if you've been convicted, right? And so he's kind of the face of that. Everyone, I think, in the 80s and 90s knows Parnell in 2000s is a violent criminal. But someone like him would slip through the cracks. So he becomes kind of the face in a lot of articles in opposition to modifying the law.
So their point is, like you said, if we leave the law the way it is, somebody like Parnell gets put away for life.
Right.
If you modify it, then somebody like Parnell could walk free and perpetrate, which we...
Not free, but just not life in prison.
Right. He would get the number of years and get out.
Right.
Parnell pleads innocent, and his defense for the crime of trying to buy a child is once again something we've all heard, that he just wanted a family, and according to his lawyer, quote, simply interested in raising an abandoned boy.
Are you kidding?
Why do you have to buy an abandoned boy?
Right? There are methods for building a family.
Adoption.
Right. Not that I think he would qualify for that. But
No, but it's crazy that he uses. I would be interested to see if whether is that the defense attorney's position, or is that Parnell saying, "Hey, man, this is why I did it."
Well, we have some Parnell quotes coming up which explains this. So I think it's Parnell. We've seen this more than once, so I don't think it's coming solely from the defense. But before that, his lawyer also argues that his convictions are so old they shouldn't be considered under the 3 strikes law. They also play up his age and his health, and that he's in a wheelchair, and that he's really incapable of being a threat to anyone, and that asking for a child was all, quote, wish fantasy, as he didn't ask for her, and he didn't ask for this woman, whose name we haven't given because she's still living her life, but to steal a child.
But he asked to buy a child.
His defense attorney disagrees. Parnell tells the San Jose Mercury News, quote, time is running out on me. I wanted to raise him just like any child. I wanted to be loved. I guess it was wrong. I thought a child would love me for what I am and not what I was. It's easier for a child to become attached to me when they're young. He also said that he had no plans to sexually abuse the child.
That quote is terrible. That last line alone, it's easier for a child to become attached to me when they're young. Knowing it's vile.
Right. And it kind of gives away what Parnell's real motive. I mean, that he's the kind of man who manipulates, and he knows what he's doing, and he's done this before, and it's all part of the same thing. The prosecutor disagrees with everything both Parnell and his defense attorney say. And in the CNN article, he says the defendant is a danger at any age. This defendant is a threat to children of any age. Again, there is threat of people buying into the argument about the one of him especially not being a threat. When he's arrested, several of his neighbors are interviewed, and in the SF Gate in 2003, one says, and I won't give names for these because I'm not trying to out anyone or shame them or anything, just give a fuller understanding of, I guess, reactions to sexual abuse. But he says, quote, I don't believe it. The old man didn't have money to buy a pack of cigarettes, let alone a child. He can't hardly get down those steps. As far as I'm concerned, a small child would whip him. So this is just kind of, I think, it feeds into what we've talked about with victims and how they feel, and this idea that if someone can hurt a person, that they can't hurt a child.
Right, because looking at it, 7-year-old man in a wheelchair, he's not a threat to anyone.
Right.
Even projecting images of like loved ones or grandparents, like grandfatherly. Oh, look at the cute old man that's literally a serial rapist in California. It doesn't matter what age they are.
But it also goes back to victims, and victims always having to be someone who fought hard against the person, or what consent really is. It's kind of all steeped in that. All those stereotypes and myths.
If you were stronger or better, you would have defeated that person. You would have physically overcome them or run or whatever.
And this isn't an unusual opinion. In earlier articles that I had read even before, when he's just getting placed in Berkeley, a lot of people interviewed in Berkeley felt he wasn't dangerous, mainly because of his age. Or one person who knew Parnell in Berkeley felt those crimes he had committed, they were over and done with. He served his time, which is a good for lots of other things. In Parnell's case, it's probably not a good opinion to have because he does keep committing crimes.
There's a lot of cases. I mean, we've talked about it. Lawrence Singleton. Right.
Mm-hmm.
He was an old man, and I think there was one recently in the news of someone who had been released. He was too old to commit again, and he did. So it's not uncommon, or I wouldn't say uncommon, but it happens.
Right. When news reaches the Stayner family that Parnell has been arrested, as you can imagine, they're very angry. Delbert Stayner tells the San Francisco Chronicle, quote, he took my son for his own sick sexual pleasure. That man is a predator who never should have been released. He should have died of old age behind bars. Parnell ruined my family's life. Trial begins for these new crimes in February 2004 in Oakland Superior Court. Oakland, like Hayward and Berkeley, is also in Alameda County and is the largest city. Oakland is between 5 to 6 miles from Berkeley, but it actually takes a lot longer to get there. There's a lot of traffic. Oakland, like Berkeley, often has a reputation of a certain kind of city, but they're really diverse places with a lot of interesting history and stories, and one of the places I hope we can cover more in other episodes. The Alameda Superior Court's current building in Oakland, and the one the trial took place in, was built in the 1930s. It's the main, or a mother court it's called, for Alameda County. It sits on Lake Merritt, which is a partially man-made lake in Oakland that's commonly referred to as the Lake of a Thousand Smells. There's a great and quick PBS video that covers the lake's history, and we will put that on our site. But just a couple of quick facts. The lake is actually a slough, which means it's a drainage waterway. Before there was a dam put in place, waste would flow from the city into the waterway and be carried out to the bay. After the dam, it becomes more like a lake, but it still has all of that drainage going into it and no way for it to go out. So just a really interesting area. It's really pretty, and there's a bunch of interesting stuff in that video. So, and also people believe there's a Loch Ness monster there called the Oak Ness Monster. And it's right in front of the building, the Superior Court.
So it's Oakland's very own cryptid.
Right. When trial starts, Parnell is brought inside the courtroom in a wheelchair. He tried to avoid cameras and was wearing a red jumpsuit. He had the option to wear street clothes, but made a request to wear that jumpsuit. During the trial, the judge allows the prior kidnappings to be presented as evidence, and both Randall Sean Poorman and Timothy White testify. Stephen Stayner doesn't testify because he's already passed away, something we'll talk about next episode. The first to testify is Timothy White. In 2004, Timothy is 29 years old, and he testifies about his kidnapping in detail. While he does so, according to the Press-Democrat, Sean Poorman, who is 38 years old, waits outside in the hall, as he is meant to testify directly afterward. Once Timothy was done testifying, he leaves the court and enters the hall where he and Poorman come face-to-face for the first time since the original trial in 1981. The two hug, and Poorman apologizes to Timothy. Timothy White replied, "It's okay, I've got a good wife." Afterwards, Poorman went inside the courtroom and testified once again against Parnell.
That's amazing. Sorry, I just have to say that. I think it's amazing that those two...
Yeah, and it's a nice moment, and we have a picture of it, so we'll make sure that goes up on our site as well, and we'll put it out on social media.
Because it would have been very easy for Poorman never have said anything. He could have waited and not, but then to apologize... When he, and I know we've talked about it, but where he himself, through a certain lens, was a victim of Parnell's manipulations.
Yeah, and for them to hug.
Right.
It's just a nice moment. In his closing arguments, the prosecutor said, quote, "I think he is a poster child for the three strikes law. The defendant is a danger at any age. The defendant was looking for one last hurrah, one last Stephen Stayner, one last Timmy White." The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours and found Parnell guilty. The judge sentenced Parnell under the three strikes law to 25 years to life in prison. On January 21st, 2008, Kenneth Parnell died from natural causes at the California Medical Facility in Vacaville. Kenneth Parnell died at the age of 76. During those 76 years, Parnell hurt countless numbers of people, and that effect lasts today. We may not be able to stop men like Parnell, but we can work to end society's role in causing more pain for victims of these terrible crimes. Next episode, we will continue that thought as we cover the lives of Parnell's victims in our last episode in the series of the life and kidnapping of Stephen Stayner.
Tonight's cold case comes from the Mendocino Sheriff's Department. Genevieve Catherine Alexander was last seen by her boyfriend walking away from the couple's residence located at Pomo Campground on April 4th, 2013 at 3:30 p.m. Alexander was wearing a maroon fleece type of jacket, dark-colored pants, and dark-colored tennis shoes at the time of her disappearance. It was suspected at the time of Alexander's disappearance that she was having a delusional episode. On April 5th, 2013, at approximately 9 a.m., Sheriff's Officer investigators, with the aid of the Mendocino County Sheriff's Office Search and Rescue Team, initiated a further search of Alexander. During the search, it was learned that a resident who lived adjacent to Mendocino Coast had contacted a person trespassing on their property on April 4, 2013, at approximately 4 p.m. The person that was trespassing matched Alexander's physical and clothing description. A Sheriff's Office Search and Rescue Team bloodhound began a scent search from the location of the trespass scene and ended behind the Mendocino Coast Botanical Gardens along the bluff line at the trailhead that led downward towards the beach. While conducting a search of the beach, a pair of pants was found floating in the ocean a short distance from the beach. When the pants were recovered, they were identified as being pants Alexander was wearing at the time of her disappearance. As of April 5, 2013, at 5 p.m., Alexander's current whereabouts are unknown and no further items of clothing have been recovered. At the time of her disappearance, she was 30 years old, height 5 feet 6 inches, and weighed approximately 115 to 120 pounds, with brown hair and blue eyes. Anyone with any information relating to Alexander's disappearance or whereabouts is urged to contact the Sheriff's Office tip line at 707-234-2100.
Thank you once again for joining us on this episode. You can always follow us on our social media, on Twitter at Cali True Crime, as well as Facebook, Instagram. You can email us at calitruecrime@gmail.com. We'd love to hear from you and drop us a line. Also, please review us on your podcasting app of choice. We'd also like to thank, as always, Melanie Duncan, our quality control guru. This has been a production of Chateau Walnut.